When I was 19, I was dating this guy who was a complete loser. But at the time, I was young, dumb, and in love. One night, my ex-boyfriend, I'll call him Quinn, and I was driving back from seeing his parents. We were arguing, as we seemed to do a lot at that point in our relationship, and I told Quinn something that pissed him off, and he pulled off to the side of a deserted road. He then proceeded to tell me to get out. At first, I just laughed him off, thinking that he was being dramatic and wouldn't really throw me out. That was the first mistake I made that night. I thought that my ex wouldn't throw someone he claimed to love out into the night, alone and without a way to get back home. When Quinn refused to drive me back home, I started yelling at him, telling him there was no way I was getting out of his car. That's when he got out, went around to my door, opened it, and then dragged me out of the car. He then threw me on the ground and ran back to his car, started it back up, and started driving off. The bastard didn't even have the decency to leave me my phone for me to call for someone to pick me up. Even if he did, I didn't know where I was and was slightly drunk, so I would have been screwed either way. I was on the verge of tears when I saw headlights approaching from behind me and turned to see a white car approaching. I quickly waved at the car until it stopped, and an older gentleman got out with concern and asked me if I was okay and why I was in the middle of the road. I immediately fell for his false kindness and sobbed to him about my shitty boyfriend and relationship, in which the man nodded his head and listened to me. After I finished my tale, I looked at the man I later learned to be named Walter, and then looked at his car before I asked him if he could give me a ride home. That was my second mistake. When I got into Walter's car, I heard the lock snap into place, which didn't scare me at first because, for most people, you hit the lock button as soon as you get into your car. We enjoyed a comfortable silence until Walter started asking me questions. It started innocently, and he asked me if I had any pets at home. Then, he started asking if Quinn was my first boyfriend I've had. From there, the questions started getting more personal. He asked if I had done anything with Quinn. You know, intimate things. When I was too embarrassed and freaked out to answer, Walter told me that I looked too innocent to know about those things, and that Quinn didn't know how to handle a girl like me. That Quinn stranded me in the middle of nowhere because he wasn't the man I needed who could take charge, but a little boy who was afraid to go after what he wanted. When Walter started talking about the things he could do to me to turn me from a girl to a woman, that's when I had enough. I started looking out the windows for nearby rest stops in the distance where I could ask him to let me out, but when I saw none, I looked at the door handle, contemplating if I could survive jumping out of the still-moving car. But that's when I noticed the third mistake I made that night. Walter's car was an older model you couldn't unlock from your side yourself. He had locked me in as effectively as Quinn threw me out. I was so focused on getting out of the car that I didn't notice Walter's hand on my upper thigh until it started creeping up. I don't know how I got so lucky, but before Walter could go further, flashing lights appeared from behind us. The police. Walter's eyes had widened, and he immediately pulled over to the side of the road. I thought the nightmare was over, but that was until Walter pulled out a knife and told me to get out of the car and stand in the middle of the road between him and the cop's car. I was too scared and wanted to get away from him by that point that I was out of his car in seconds. And when I got out, Walter sped off. The road was very narrow, and instead of attempting to go around me, a female officer came out of the car to see if I was okay. That's when I cried for the second time that night and told them what happened in the car with Walter. The police officer then called in on the radio with our location, along with Walter's car's license plate. The police officer, seeing the fear and confusion on my face, informed me that they had pulled us over because they were looking for a car that matched Walter's and was involved in several crimes involving assaults on female hitchhikers around my age. I was stunned and don't remember all the details she told me about his past victims, too paralyzed by fear at the time, but I do remember me accepting her offer of a ride home after the female assured me for several minutes that I could trust her. When I got home, I went to my room and didn't tell my family anything. I was too embarrassed by what happened, and I felt totally responsible for what happened to me. I'm still traumatized from that night, but it taught me a lesson. Never take rides from a stranger. So this is a real crazy story that happened to me a while back. I'm no writer or anything, but I thought I'd share this because it still freaks me out to this day. It was a dark, moonless night, and I was driving down this long, desolate road in the middle of nowhere. I'm talking pitch black all around, and the only light came from my car's headlights. Yeah, that kind of eerie setting. I was about halfway through this seemingly endless stretch of road when I saw him. A guy, standing there on the side of the road. Looked like he'd been walking for miles. Now, I'm not the kind to normally pick up hitchhikers, but something about this guy just seemed off, like he really needed help. So I pulled over and rolled down the window. He walked up to me, and man, he looked messed up. He had dirty clothes, wild hair, and his eyes, they had this strange, distant look, like he'd seen things that scarred him for life. But hey, I thought I was doing a good deed. "Need a ride, buddy?" I asked, trying to sound friendly. He nodded and muttered a quick, "Thanks," and hopped into the passenger seat. As he got in, I caught a whiff of this awful stench, like something had crawled inside him and died. But I figured he'd been walking for hours, so I didn't say anything. We drove in silence for a while. The only sound was the hum of the engine. It was starting to get to me, so I decided to break the ice. "So, where are you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He turned to me, and I swear his eyes had this creepy glint to them. "Just keep driving," he said, his voice low and hoarse. It made me feel uneasy, but I thought maybe he was just tired or something. So I kept driving. But as time went on, things started getting weirder. He started muttering under his breath, like he was talking to himself. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but it sounded like some kind of prayer or curse or something. Then he started fidgeting in his seat, his hands twitching. I asked him if he was okay, and he snapped at me, "Just drive!" His voice had this menacing edge to it. I didn't know what to do. I was in the middle of nowhere with this crazy guy in my car. But I kept driving, hoping to reach the next town soon. That's when things took a really dark turn. Out of nowhere, he lunged at me, his hands wrapped around my throat. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I swerved the car, trying to shake him off, but he was like a madman possessed. He kept squeezing, and I thought I was a goner. But then, by some miracle, I managed to slam on the brakes, and the sudden stop sent him flying forward. He hit the windshield with a sickening thud and fell back, clutching his head in pain. I didn't waste a second. I threw open the door and bolted out of the car, gasping for air. I looked back, and the guy was crawling over the seat towards me, his eyes filled with this unholy rage. I couldn't believe it. I didn't stick around to find out what he was going to do next. I sprinted into the trees, and eventually I came to a road where I saw the distant glow of a gas station. I ran inside, my heart pounding, and called the cops. They arrived pretty quickly, and I told them everything. But when we went back to the car, the guy was gone, vanished without a trace. They searched the area, but there was no sign of him anywhere. I had to get some medical attention for the bruises on my neck, and the cops took my statement. They never found the guy, and I don't know what the heck was wrong with him, but I'll never forget those cold, empty eyes. That night has made me swear off picking up hitchhikers for good, no matter how much they look like they need help. Trust your instincts out there, and stay safe on those dark, lonely roads. You never know who or what you might come across. I was told this story by my dad as a warning to never hitchhike or take rides from strangers. It makes me shudder that he had a run-in with a monster. This story takes place during the 70s, when my dad was a carefree teenager living in California. Back then, families generally had one car to split between a large group of people. If you wanted to get somewhere and didn't have a car, you bummed a ride from kindly Good Samaritan Joe's. Dad spent one day with his friends at the beach. Eventually, it got late, and the party decided to make their way home. There was no room left in his friend's car, nor did he have any money to use a payphone, so Dad elected to hitchhike. It was considered relatively safe, so he didn't give much thought to it. After saying goodbye to his friends, Dad started walking, and when he hit the freeway, he stuck out his thumb. Sure enough, a green Ford Econoline van pulled up next to him. The guy driving the truck had longer hair, but was clean-shaven and soft-spoken. Something in the man's eyes, as Dad put it later, made him want to take off and run. But it was getting dark, so Dad ignored the creepy feeling in his gut as he got into the car. The man asked where Dad wanted to go and then took off. Dad settled in, and being the outgoing guy he was, started chatting politely. The guy, who introduced himself as John, put Dad at ease, asking him questions about what music he liked, movies he had seen, about his family and other things. By the time they reached Dad's suburb, Dad was so at ease, he had completely forgotten the creepy feeling he had had. John pulled into the driveway of Dad's house when he looked pensive for a moment. "You shouldn't hitch rides with people you don't know." "Well, I appreciate you being a nice guy and giving me a ride home," Dad said, about to jump out of the van and head inside. John tapped the steering wheel, pausing as if trying to find words to say. The creepy feeling returned to Dad's gut, but he'd been lulled by John's chatty nature and kindness in giving him a ride home. "I mean it. Be careful who you take rides from," John said, a strange look in his eye. It was like the look that nearly convinced Dad to run. It was a look of wanting. "You don't know what kind of people will take advantage of you at a bad time." "Thanks for the warning," Dad said, moving his hand to the door handle, hoping to slip out before John could take off. John reached a hand over and rested it on Dad's thigh, giving him that creepy look. "I mean it, man. You're just a kid. You don't know people. Not like I do." Dad didn't care to listen to anything else he had to say. Instead, he jumped out of the van and ran inside the house. Before he could do anything else, John pulled out of the driveway and drove away into the night. In a rare case of, listen to the creepy person giving life advice, Dad took John's words of wisdom and never hitchhiked again. He always made sure that he had money to call from a payphone and worked hard to get his first car, a beat-up Chevy. In time, Dad went to college, met Mom, settled down with a nice job, and had my siblings and me. He tried to put the experience out of his mind, but sometimes he'd have nightmares of John and those creepy eyes. It wasn't until 1996, when he was listening to the news, that Dad realized just what a close call he had. The first man to be executed by lethal injection, William Bonin, had just been put to death for murdering several hitchhikers during the 60s and 70s. Dad saw Bonin's mugshot, and the blood turned to ice in his veins. There was John, glaring at the camera. Dad looked up more about Bonin, who had been nicknamed the Freeway Killer. He was active around the time he picked up Dad, and looked for Caucasian or Latino adolescents and young men with longish hair, just like Dad. Dad is convinced that Bonin was on the prowl that day when he picked up my dad, but for some reason, decided to let him go and live. There's no doubt about it, picking up hitchhikers can be dangerous, but if it was up to me, I would always be the one driving the car, rather than the one at the side of the road with my thumb out. Picking up hitchhikers is dangerous. Being picked up is far, far worse. A lot of the time when people submit horror stories about hitchhiking, the tales they tell sound like those old campfire stories. Urban myths we've all heard before, about a guy with a hooked hand or an axe murderer dressed up as a little old lady. In almost every case, it's the hitchhiker who's the bad guy, which when you think about it, doesn't really make sense. Obviously, there's a danger to any driver who picks up a stranger on some lonely road in the middle of the night, but the same is true in reverse. As someone who did a lot of hitchhiking in my youth, I can tell you from experience that in reality, it's the drivers who are more likely to be the monsters. From the weird old perverts who think that they're owed if they give you a lift, to the truly psychotic nutjobs who see hitchhikers as potential prey, the drivers can be just as bad as any campfire boogeyman who chooses to hitch a ride. Trust me, I know. What's kinda worse about being the hitchhiker in this scenario is the fact that you can never tell. You're literally volunteering to get into the car with these people based upon a few seconds' glance. How could you ever tell from one brief image whether the guy is a decent man who will take you where you want to go, or the kind of guy who keeps a hammer and a length of rope in his glove compartment? The answer is you can't. You can tell yourself that you have good instincts, that you're a good judge of character, but once you're in the car and speeding along, you're vulnerable, basically trapped in there with this person until they choose to let you out, never quite knowing who's a nice guy and who really, really isn't. My worst ever experience hitchhiking did not involve a hooked hand or an axe murderer. In fact, it involved no gore or violence at all, as far as I know, but it was undeniably awful. I had been standing by the side of the road for around 2 hours when he pulled up. I was hoping to get to the city around 40 miles away, and the guy driving agreed to take me. I remember he was driving a blue sedan car and he wore glasses. He had a friendly smile and had both a St. Christopher medallion and a crucifix hanging from his wing mirror. Looking into the neatly kept car, I decided that this looked like a fairly safe option. If it hadn't been for his lack of facial hair, I'd have said that this guy looked like a real-life Ned Flanders, and to some extent he sounded like one too. This much I remember. He was a talkative kind of guy, and had me sit up front with him so he could chat along as we drove. In the course of the conversation, he asked me about my family. Now, without going into any details, I'll just say that this was a touchy subject at the time, and partly the reason I was hitchhiking in the first place. When he asked if I lived with my mom and dad, I said I couldn't remember. That one phrase changed things. The guy began to look disturbed and twitchy as he asked me what I meant by I couldn't remember. He then got into this whole philosophical debate, mostly with himself, about how memory was of the utmost importance. His words became snappy, and he spoke in short, aggressive bursts that also involved him raising his voice, as if chastising me. He talked about how it's your memories that make your personality, how it's memories that define and build you, and how memories should be cherished. I kept my mouth shut. Clearly, he wasn't happy with what I'd said. For a moment, I thought that maybe I touched a nerve. Maybe he had a relative with Alzheimer's or dementia. So to him, the idea that someone would be so flippant about remembering things was a touchy subject. Maybe he was an alcoholic or drug addict in his past and had big gaps in his own memories. Either way, the atmosphere in the car had undoubtedly changed and become awfully uncomfortable. Eventually, he came to a silence. Then, smiling as if in an attempt to break the tension, he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a family pack of candy bars. He took one, and laughing to himself told me that this was his secret stash. His wife didn't like him eating too much chocolate, so he kept them in here as a little treat for himself. He grinned, made me promise not to tell, and bit down on one as he smirked. He then offered me one of the others, and in an attempt to lighten the mood, I accepted. That was a mistake. When I woke up, I was back at exactly the point where the guy picked me up. I was laying on my back as if sleeping. I remember sitting bolt upright and shouting, as if waking from a nightmare in a fit of panic and desperately trying to work out where I was. Eventually, I worked out where I was, but had no idea how I'd gotten there. Had he just driven me around in a circle and dumped me at the side of the road? Panicked, I checked my pockets and bag to make sure I had all my possessions and important things like documents and wallet. I also checked myself to make sure that I hadn't been injured, bruised, or interfered with in any way. As far as I could tell, I was fine, exactly as I had been just before he picked me up. I knew even then that there must have been something in the candy bar, and that after eating it, I had clearly passed out. I had lost time and had a huge gap in my memory, during which literally anything could have happened. It was only around 4 hours later, after another hitched ride, when I arrived in the city, that I realized just how serious this was, because when I looked at the cover of a newspaper, I saw that it was no longer the same day. In fact, it was a full week later. An entire week of my life was missing. I wasn't hurt. I hadn't been violated or robbed, and as far as I could tell, nothing untoward had happened to me. But an entire week of my life was missing. From the moment I ate that chocolate bar to the moment I woke up, there was just a blank space of 7 days. What happened between those points, where I was taken, how I was fed, cleaned, and went to the toilet, I don't know. My friends have told me to visit a doctor, to get an x-ray to make sure nothing was put into me or even taken out. But if it had, there would be scars or wounds, right? They also said I should look myself up on the internet to make sure there aren't photos of me naked all over some weirdo sites. I haven't looked. What exactly happened to me and why the guy drugged me, I will never know. And of course, now, I can't remember.